Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm your host Vanessa and I'm delighted you've joined me for an exploration of perhaps one of the most beloved and influential novelists in English literature. Before we dive in, grab yourself a cup of tea. I'm enjoying a robust blend of London breakfast this morning, and there's something wonderfully fitting about a London tea as we venture into the smoky, bustling world of Victorian England's greatest chronicler. We've journeyed through the passionate intensity of the Bronte sisters, where individual psychology and personal relationships dominated the literary landscape. Today we're stepping into a completely different kind of literary universe, one populated by vast casts of characters, sweeping social panoramas, and stories that captured the imagination of an entire nation and beyond. Charles Dickens. The name alone conjures images of foggy London streets, workhouses, Christmas ghosts, and unforgettable characters like Oliver Twist, Scrooge, and David Copperfield. But here's what I want you to understand today. Dickens wasn't just a storyteller or an entertainer. He was a social revolutionary who used fiction as a weapon against injustice. This is a man who transformed his own experiences of poverty, humiliation, and abandonment into stories that exposed the brutal realities of industrial capitalism. He wrote novels that literally changed laws, influenced social policy, and shifted public opinion about the poor, the vulnerable, and the forgotten members of society. Dickens certainly did love an orphan. And he didn't just write about the Industrial Revolution. He lived through it, suffered from it, and then dedicated his literary career to showing his readers exactly what it was doing to human beings. He became known as the people's author, because he gave a voice to those who had no voice, dignity to those who were treated as disposable, and hope to those who had been forgotten by the system. So let's step into the grimy, vibrant, heartbreaking, and ultimately hopeful world of Charles Dickens, and discover how a boy who once pasted labels on bottles in a rat-infested factory became the conscience of his age. Charles Dickens was born in Portsmouth on February 7, 1812, into a world that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. The Industrial Revolution was transforming England from an agricultural society into an urban industrial powerhouse, and the social disruptions were enormous. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, respectable middle-class employment that should have provided a comfortable life for the family. But John had a fatal flaw. He lived beyond his means. He was generous, optimistic, and completely incapable of managing money. This weakness would define Charles's childhood and ultimately his entire literary career. When Charles was 10, the family moved to Camden Town in London, where John's debts finally caught up with him. In February 1824, when Charles was just 12 years old, his father was arrested for debt and sent to Marshalsea Prison, the same debtor's prison that would later appear in Little Dorrit. A little fun fact, if you visit Charles Dickens's house in London, you can actually see the bars from the Marshalsea prison. Here's where Charles's story becomes both heartbreaking and informative. While his father was in prison, Charles was sent to work at Warren's Blacking Warehouse, a rat-infested factory near the Thames, where he spent 10 hours a day pasting labels on bottles of boot polish for 6 shillings a week. Think about this. A 12-year-old boy from a respectable middle-class family suddenly thrust into the world of child labor that was common for the working class. Charles worked alongside boys who had known poverty and hardship all their lives. But for him, this was a catastrophic fall from respectability. The psychological impact was devastating. Years later, Dickens would write, "No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sank into this companionship, and felt my hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my bosom." But here's what's crucial. This experience didn't just traumatize Charles, it educated him. He saw firsthand how the industrial system treated children as disposable labor. He experienced the shame and desperation of poverty. He learned what it felt like to be invisible to people in positions of power and privilege. Most importantly, he discovered that poverty wasn't a moral failing. It was a systemic problem. The boys he worked with weren't lazy or vicious. They were trapped in circumstances beyond their control, just as he was. This insight would become the foundation of his entire social philosophy. After a few months, Charles's father was released from prison, and Charles was allowed to return to school. But the damage was done, or rather, the education was complete. He had seen behind the comfortable facade of middle-class respectability to the brutal realities that supported it. Charles threw himself into education and self-improvement with fierce determination. He became a court reporter, then a journalist, covering politics and social issues for various newspapers and periodicals. His facility with language, His eye for character and his understanding of social dynamics quickly made him one of London's most sought-after writers. In 1836, at the age of 24, he published the first installment of The Pickwick Papers, a comic serial about a group of gentlemen's adventures around England. It was an immediate sensation. Suddenly, people all over Britain were waiting eagerly for the next monthly installment, discussing the characters as if they were real people and making Dickens wealthy and famous. The fame of Dickens is something I want to touch on briefly before we move forward, especially after we discuss the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen in the previous weeks. While Jane Austen published anonymously as a lady and died without ever seeing her name on a book cover, and while the Bronte sisters hid behind their pseudonyms of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, Charles Dickens was a Victorian rock star. Austen earned maybe £700 total from her writing, barely enough for a modest living, and the Brontes, though they achieved some recognition, never experienced anything like the wealth or widespread fame before their tragically early deaths. Dickens, on the other hand, he was probably the first true literary celebrity in the modern sense. His serialized novels had people lining up at newsstands, his public readings sold out massive venues, and he made a fortune that allowed him to live like a gentleman, buying country estates, supporting large households, and traveling internationally. When he toured America, he was mobbed like Taylor Swift or Elvis. It's a striking reminder that literary success looks different depending on when, and as whom, you publish. The women wrote in relative obscurity. Dickens wrote in the spotlight. But even in his early, relatively lighthearted work, you can see Dickens' social consciousness developing. The Pickwick Papers include scenes in debtors' prisons, critiques of legal corruption, and sympathetic portraits of working-class characters who are usually ignored or caricatured in literature. The success of Pickwick launched Dickens into a career of extraordinary productivity and influence. Between 1837 and 1870, he published 15 major novels, countless short stories and essays, edited magazines, gave public readings that drew thousands of people, and maintained a schedule that would exhaust most people today. But what drove this incredible energy wasn't just ambition or even creative passion. It was a sense of mission. Dickens had experienced both sides of Victorian society, the comfortable respectability of middle class and the desperate vulnerability of the poor. He understood from personal experience how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between security and destitution. This dual perspective, insider and outsider, respectable gentleman and former factory boy, gave Dickens a unique authority to write about social issues. He wasn't a wealthy philanthropist looking down on the poor from a position of privilege. He was someone who had been there, who remembered what it felt like to be powerless and invisible. The childhood trauma at Warren's blacking warehouse became the engine that powered his entire career. Every neglected child in his novels, every character struggling with poverty, every critique of social indifference can be tracked down to that 12-year-old boy pasting labels on bottles while wondering if anyone would ever notice or care about his suffering. But Dickens transformed that trauma into something extraordinary, a literary career dedicated to making the invisible visible, to giving a voice to those who had no voice, and to insisting that every human being, regardless of their social position, deserved dignity, compassion, and hope. Let's pause for a moment and talk about the Industrial Revolution's impact on society. To understand why Dickens' novels were so revolutionary and why they had such enormous impact, we need to understand the world he was writing about. An England transformed by the Industrial Revolution in ways that created unprecedented wealth alongside unprecedented suffering. When Dickens was born in 1812, England was in the midst of the most rapid and dramatic social transformation in human history. In just a few generations, the country had changed from a primarily agricultural society where most people lived in small communities and worked on farms to an industrial powerhouse where millions of people crowded into rapidly growing cities to work in factories. The statistics are staggering. Between 1750 and 1850, England's population doubled. Manchester grew from a market town of 20,000 people to an industrial city of 250,000. Birmingham, Liverpool, Sheffield all exploded in size as people flocked to where the new factory jobs were. But this rapid growth came at an enormous human cost. The new industrial cities were built quickly and cheaply, with no planning for sanitation, housing, or public health. Workers lived in overcrowded slums, often entire families sharing single rooms. Open sewers ran through the streets, clean water was scarce, disease was rampant. The working conditions were even worse. Factory owners, driven by competition and the desire for profit, pushed workers to their physical limits. The working day was typically 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. Child labor was commonplace. Children as young as 5 worked in textile mills, climbing under dangerous machinery to tie broken threads. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent. Industrial accidents were frequent and often fatal. Workers who were injured or became too old to work had no support system. There was no workers' compensation, no unemployment benefits, no social safety net of any kind. But here's what made this particularly tragic. The Industrial Revolution was also creating unprecedented wealth. Factory owners, merchants, and investors were becoming richer. The gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. This is the world that Dickens wrote about, and he understood it from both sides. He had experienced poverty and vulnerability personally, but he had also achieved middle-class respectability and financial success. He could see how the system worked and how it failed. What made Dickens' social criticism so powerful was his ability to show the human cost of industrial capitalism in concrete personal terms. Instead of writing abstract arguments about economic policy, he created characters whose individual stories illuminated larger social problems. Look at how this works in Oliver Twist, published in 1838. The novel opens in a workhouse, the Victorian institution designed to house the poor while making their lives so miserable they would do anything to avoid staying there. The theory was that if you made poverty uncomfortable enough, people would be motivated to work harder and pull themselves up. But Dickens shows that this theory is both cruel and false. Oliver is an orphan. He's poor, through no fault of his own. The workhouse authorities aren't helping him develop skills or find opportunities. They're simply warehousing him while providing the minimum food and shelter necessary to keep him alive. The famous scene where Oliver asks for more gruel isn't just about hunger, it's about human dignity. Oliver's request is perfectly reasonable. He's a growing boy who isn't getting enough food to survive. But the workhouse authorities treat his request as outrageous rebellion because the system depends on keeping the poor grateful for whatever they're given, no matter how inadequate. When Oliver runs away to London, Dickens shows us another aspect of industrial society, the criminal underworld that develops when legitimate opportunities are unavailable. Fagin's gang of child thieves isn't just colorful criminal characters. They're the inevitable result of a society that offers no legitimate path out of poverty for abandoned children. But perhaps Dickens' most comprehensive critique of industrial society appears in Little Dorrit, where the Circumlocution Office represents the bureaucratic machinery that keeps the poor powerless while protecting the wealthy. The office's unofficial model, How Not to Do It, captures Dickens' view of government institutions that exist primarily to prevent change rather than solve problems. Throughout all these novels, Dickens shows how industrial capitalism creates a society where individual kindness and moral feeling are constantly at war with systemic pressures. Good people are forced to make bad choices by circumstances beyond their control. Evil flourishes not because people are naturally wicked, but because the system rewards selfishness and punishes compassion. But Dickens wasn't just a critic. He was also a believer in human potential. His novels consistently argue that social problems are solvable, that institutions can be reformed, and that individuals can choose to act with kindness and integrity, even in corrupt systems. Let's talk about Charles Dickens' role as a social reformer. Here's what made Charles Dickens extraordinary. He didn't just write about social problems, he actively worked to solve them. He used his fame, his wealth, and his literary genius as tools for social reform, becoming one of the most effective advocates for social change in Victorian England. The power of Dickens' novels to influence the public opinion were unprecedented. When Oliver Twist was serialized, it sparked national outrage about the treatment of children in workhouses. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which had created the harsh workhouse system, became increasingly unpopular as readers saw its effects through Oliver's story. But Dickens didn't stop with fiction. He wrote countless articles for his magazines, Household Words and All the Year Round, exposing specific abuses and calling for concrete reforms. He investigated conditions in schools, prisons, factories, and slums, and then wrote detailed reports that combined journalistic accuracy with his novelist's gift for making readers care about individual suffering. One of his most effective pieces was A Walk in a Workhouse, published in 1850. Dickens visited a London workhouse and described what he saw with devastating precision. The separation of families, the deliberately humiliating conditions, the way the systems crushed humanity in the name of discouraging dependency. The article caused such public outcry that the workhouse conditions were gradually improved. This became Dickens' pattern: investigate, expose, and use public pressure to force reform. His influence on educational reform was particularly significant. Nicholas Nickleby's of brutal Yorkshire boarding schools led to the closure of many of the worst institutions. Remember the Bronte sisters' experience in their boarding school from last week? Dickens showed how these schools, advertised as respectable educational establishments, were actually dumping grounds where inconvenient children were warehoused under horrific conditions. The character of Wackford Squeers, the sadistic headmaster of Dotheboys Hall, became so famous that Squeers entered the language as a synonym for educational abuse. Parents became more careful about where they sent their children, and reformers used Dickens' novels as evidence for the need for educational regulation. But Dickens' most sustained reform campaign focused on child labor. Having experienced it himself, he understood intimately how industrial capitalism exploited children. His novels consistently showed children working in dangerous conditions, separated from their families, denied education, and normal childhood development. The public response was enormous. Middle-class readers, who had never thought much about factory conditions, were shocked by Dickens' descriptions. His ability to make readers identify with working-class characters broke down the class barriers that usually prevented social sympathy. A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, represents perhaps Dickens' most successful piece of social reform literature. On the surface, it's a simple ghost story about a miser who learns to be generous, but it's actually a sophisticated argument about social responsibility and the interconnectedness of human welfare. Scrooge's transformation isn't just personal, it's social. When he becomes generous and kind, he doesn't just feel better about himself, he actively improves the lives of people around him. He raises Bob Cratchit's salary, then helps Tiny Tim get medical care, and supports charitable causes. The story's message is clear. Individual prosperity means nothing if it's built on others' suffering. True success requires social responsibility, and social problems can be solved if people of wealth and influence choose to act with compassion rather than indifference. The novella was enormously popular and influential. It helped establish many of our modern Christmas traditions around family, generosity, and social charity. More importantly, it changed how many people thought about their social obligations, making charity and social concern fashionable among the middle and upper classes. Dickens also worked directly with reform organizations. He supported the Ragged Schools movement, which provided basic education for the poorest children. He served on the board of Urania Cottage, a home for former prostitutes that helped women develop skills and find respectable employment. He used his celebrity status to raise money for charitable causes, giving dramatic public readings of his works with all proceeds going to schools, hospitals, and relief funds. These readings were hugely popular. Dickens was a gifted performer who could make audiences laugh and cry within minutes. But perhaps his most important contribution to social reform was changing how people thought about poverty and social problems. Before Dickens, most middle-class people believed that poverty was caused by moral failings, that poor people were poor because they were lazy, vicious, or improvident. Dickens' novels consistently showed that poverty was caused by systemic factors: lack of education, industrial accidents, economic downturns, family breakdown. His characters weren't poor because they were bad people. They were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. This shift in understanding was crucial for social reform. Once people began to see poverty as a social problem rather than individual moral failing, they became more willing to support government intervention, labor reforms, and social welfare programs. Dickens' influence extended far beyond literature. Social reformers like Lloyd Shaftesbury quoted his novels in parliamentary debates. Factory inspectors carried his books with them as evidence of working conditions. Philanthropists cited his characters when arguing charitable institutions. His novels literally changed laws. The publicity around Oliver Twist contributed to reforms in workhouse management. Hard Times influenced labor legislation. Little Dorrit's satire of government bureaucracy led to civil service reforms. But Dickens' greatest achievement as a social reformer was changing the emotional climate around social issues. He made it impossible for respectable people to ignore poverty, child labor, and social injustice. He created a sense of national shame about these conditions that made reform not just politically possible, but morally necessary. He proved that literature could be a powerful force for social change, that stories could move hearts and minds in ways that statistics and political arguments could not. His combination of entertainment and moral instruction created a new model for socially engaged art that influenced generations of writers and activists. Let's talk about the Dickensian style and its power. What made Dickens so effective as a social reformer wasn't just his moral passion, it was his extraordinary literary technique. he developed a unique style that combined humor, pathos, psychological insight, and social observation in ways that made his novels irresistibly readable while delivering powerful social messages. First, there's his gift for creating unforgettable characters. Dickens populated his novels with people who seemed more real than most actual people we meet. Scrooge, Fagin, Micawber, Miss Havisham, Uriah Heep. These characters are so vivid, so distinctively themselves, that they've become part of our cultural vocabulary. But Dickens' characters aren't just colorful individuals. They're social types that represent broader patterns in Victorian society. Scrooge embodies the callous capitalism that values profit over human welfare. Miss Havisham represents the destructive effects of rigid class expectations. Uriah Heep shows how social hypocrisy creates its own forms of corruption. By making these social types into compelling individual characters, Dickens helps readers understand complex social issues in personal, emotional terms. Instead of abstract discussions about economic policy, he gave readers specific people to care about. His use of humor was particularly sophisticated. Dickens could make readers laugh at characters while simultaneously making them think about serious social problems. The humor makes the social criticism more palatable, while also making it more memorable. Take Mr. Micawber and David Copperfield, a character based on Dickens's own financially irresponsible father. Micawber is genuinely funny, always optimistic that something will turn up to solve his money problems. But his constant financial crises also illustrate the precarious nature of middle-class respectability and the inadequacy of the legal system for dealing with debt. Dickens' mastery of sentiment, his ability to move readers to tears, was another crucial element of his social reform strategy. Victorian readers wept over the deaths of Little Nell, Paul Dombey, and Joe, the crossing sweeper. These emotional responses weren't just entertainment, they were moral education. By making readers care deeply about fictional characters, Dickens trained them to care about real people in similar circumstances. The empathy his novels generated translated into support for social reform and charitable action. His use of symbolism and imagery was also remarkably effective. The fog that opens Bleak House represents the moral confusion and institutional corruption that prevent social progress. The dust heaps in Our Mutual Friend symbolize the waste and moral decay of industrial capitalism. These images stick in readers' minds and shape how they see the real world. Perhaps most importantly, Dickens mastered the art of serialization. His novels were published in monthly or weekly installments, which created an ongoing relationship between author and audience. Readers waited eagerly for the next chapter, discussed plot developments, and sometimes influenced the direction of the story through their responses. This serial format allowed Dickens to respond to social issues as they developed, making his novels feel immediate and relevant. It also created a sense of shared national experience. People all over Britain were reading and discussing the same stories at the same time. Kind of like when a popular TV show comes out and we're all watching it at the same time. Let's talk about the modern relevance of Dickens. What makes Dickens continue to resonate with modern readers isn't just his storytelling genius. It's how relevant his social observations remain to our contemporary struggles with economic inequality, corporate power, and government bureaucracy. The economic conditions Dickens wrote about, the concentration of wealth in fewer hands, the treatment of workers as disposable resources, the lack of social safety nets for the vulnerable, sound remarkably familiar to anyone following current debates about income inequality, labor rights, and social welfare. His critique of institutions that exist primarily to perpetuate themselves rather than serve the public good feels particularly relevant in our era of bureaucratic complexity and regulatory capture. The Circumlocution Office's motto of "How Not to Do It" could describe many modern government agencies and corporate bureaucracies. Dickens' understanding that social problems require both individual compassion and systemic change speaks to contemporary debates about the role of charity versus government action in addressing poverty and inequality. His novels suggest that both are necessary, but neither is sufficient alone. His portrayal of how rapid technological and economic change disrupts traditional communities and family structures resonates with our experiences of globalization, automation, economic disruption, and artificial intelligence. The social dislocation he described in industrial England mirrors what many communities experience today. Perhaps most importantly, Dickens' faith in the power of storytelling to create social change remains relevant in our media-saturated age. His techniques of using individual stories to eliminate broader social patterns, combining entertainment with moral instruction, and building empathy across class and cultural divides offer lessons for contemporary writers and activists. The fundamental message of his work, that every human being deserves dignity, that social problems are solvable, and that individual choices can create positive change remains as needed and inspiring today as it was in Victorian England. And just for fun, here are some little fun facts about Dickens. He was obsessed with rearranging furniture and couldn't sleep if his bed wasn't pointing north. He walked 10 to 20 miles through London almost every night, often composing stories in his head during these late-night rambles. He had a pet raven named Grip, who inspired Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Raven. He wrote under the pen name Boz in his early career. His novels were originally published in monthly installments, creating cliffhangers that had Victorian readers desperately waiting for the next chapter, like a 19th century Netflix series. He was so popular that when he killed off Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop, readers in America reportedly shouted to arriving ships, "Is Little Nell dead?" He was an accomplished amateur actor and gave dramatic public readings of his works that were wildly popular. He would perform all the character voices and essentially do one-man shows. His reading of Nancy's murder from Oliver Twist was so intense that it reportedly raised his pulse to dangerously high levels. He loved Christmas and almost single-handedly popularized many of our modern Christmas traditions through A Christmas Carol. Now, I don't want to idolize all these authors and say that they were perfect, because they absolutely were not, and Dickens might be the best example of that. Yes, he campaigned passionately for social reform and wrote movingly about the poor and downtrodden, but in his personal life, he could be shockingly cruel. After 22 years of marriage and 10 children together, he left his wife, Catherine, publicly humiliated her by publishing a statement essentially blaming her for the breakdown of their marriage, and forced their children to choose sides. He even tried to have her institutionalized. He had an affair with a young actress named Ellen Ternan. She was only 18, and they met when he was 45, and spent years maintaining their secret relationship while Catherine was erased from his life. He was often a harsh, judgmental father who seemed perpetually disappointed in his children, and while he championed the vulnerable in his books, he could be controlling, self-righteous, and egotistical in real life. It's one of those uncomfortable truths about literary history. Someone can write with tremendous empathy and compassion on the page while being quite difficult, even hurtful, to the people closest to them. Dickens loved humanity in the abstract, but the individuals in his life, that was more complicated. If you want to walk in Dickens' footsteps, England is absolutely packed with locations that bring his stories to life. And yes, we visit many of them on the book club tour. In London, you can explore the Charles Dickens Museum in his former home on Doughty Street, where he wrote Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby. You can walk through the atmospheric alleyways and coaching inns that inspired his novels. Visit the Old Curiosity Shop, which may or may not be the real one, but it's atmospheric either way, and see the areas where young Charles wandered during his blacking factory days. Outside London, there's Rochester and the surrounding Kent countryside, which Dickens loved deeply. He lived at Gad's Hill Place, which is now a boys' school, and set great expectations in the marshes nearby. You can visit the graveyard where Pip encounters Magwitch, explore Rochester's cobbled streets that appear in multiple novels, and even see the cathedral that features in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. If today's exploration of Dickens as social reformer has inspired you to delve deeper into his life and work, I've got some wonderful recommendations to enrich your understanding. Mr. Dickens and His Carol by Samantha Silva. This historical novel imagines the 6 weeks Dickens spent writing A Christmas Carol in 1843. It's a charming, fast-paced read that captures his creative process and personal struggles, perfect for Christmas time. The Invisible Woman by Claire Tomalin, the fascinating true story of Dickens' secret relationship with actress Ellen Ternan. Tomalin writes like a detective, piecing together the hidden affair that Dickens tried to keep from the public, and it reads like a novel. The Victorian City, Everyday Life in Dickens' London by Judith Flanders is an incredibly readable exploration of what daily life was actually like in Victorian London. Great for understanding the world Dickens was writing about, everything from food to crime to transportation. Drood by Dan Simmons is a dark, gripping historical thriller told from the perspective of Wilkie Collins about Dickens' final years. It's fiction, but brilliantly researched and atmospheric. Charles Dickens, A Life by Claire Tomalin. If you want one accessible, comprehensive biography, this is it. Tomalin writes beautifully and keeps the pace moving. The Mystery of Charles Dickens by A.N. Wilson, a more recent biography that focuses on Dickens' darker side and contradictions. Very engaging and offers fresh perspectives. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the extraordinary life and revolutionary work of Charles Dickens. I hope I've convinced you that he was much more than just a popular entertainer. He was a writer who used his genius to change the world. Next week, we're staying in the Victorian era, but moving into a very different literary territory as we explore Charles Dickens' most famous work, A Christmas Carol. We'll see how this beloved holiday story is actually a sophisticated piece of social criticism that helped reshape how we think about charity, social responsibility, and the meaning of success. We'll discover how Dickens packed an entire philosophy of social reform into a simple ghost story, and why this little novella continues to influence our ideas about community and compassion more than 180 years later. Until then, keep reading and stay curious. And if you've been inspired by Dickens' London and his passionate commitment to social justice, remember that you can walk the streets he walked, visit the places he wrote about, and see the world that shaped his revolutionary vision. You can find out more about experiencing Dickens' England firsthand at thebookclubtour.com. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.